"Is that your father?" My mother-in-law whispered loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. "He looks embarrassing." I remember that sentence more clearly than any vow spoken at my wedding. It hung in the air like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone could see. My name is Emily Carter, and the day that was supposed to be the happiest day of my life nearly turned into the moment I realized how little respect my new family had for the man who raised me. My wedding was held at the Grand Lakeview Hotel just outside Denver, a beautiful place with tall glass windows that looked out over the water and the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The ballroom smelled faintly of fresh roses and polished wood, and the soft music from the string quartet floated through the room like something from a movie. I had spent months planning every detail, from the ivory tablecloths to the tiny gold place cards arranged at each table. Everything looked perfect. Everything except the way my husband's parents kept looking at my father. My dad, Daniel Carter, stood near the back of the room beside the coffee station, quietly stirring cream into a paper cup. He wore the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray jacket that had probably been tailored sometime in the late 1990s. The sleeves were slightly short, and the fabric had that worn softness that comes from years of careful use. But to me, he looked exactly the way he always had when he showed up for the important moments of my life.
Strong.
Steady.
Proud.
My father spent most of his life working as a mechanic in a small auto shop about 30 miles outside the city. He was the kind of man who woke up before sunrise and came home smelling like motor oil and metal shavings. When I was a little girl, he used to lift me onto the hood of an old pickup truck while he fixed engines, explaining how everything worked with the patience of a teacher. We never had much money, but we had something better than that. We had consistency. We had loyalty. We had a father who never once missed a school recital, a soccer game, or a birthday. But apparently, to my new in-laws, none of that mattered. I noticed the first whispers during the cocktail hour.
My
husband's aunt leaned toward my mother-in-law and murmured something while glancing toward my dad. They both laughed softly behind their champagne glasses. Then my father-in-law joined them, shaking his head with the kind of tight smile people use when they're pretending to be polite. I tried to ignore it at first. Weddings make people nervous. Families who barely know each other sometimes say awkward things. That's what I told myself as I greeted guests and thanked relatives for coming. But then I heard my mother-in-law again. "Honestly," she said under her breath, "I thought Emily's family would be a little more refined." My chest tightened. My dad didn't seem to notice any of it. He was busy talking to one of the hotel waiters, asking about the view from the lake and complimenting the decorations like he was genuinely amazed by the place. That was just who he was. He never walked into a room assuming he belonged there. But he also never walked into a room feeling ashamed either. And that's when something inside me started to shift. Because I knew my father. I knew the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. What my in-laws didn't realize yet was that the man they were mocking wasn't just another guest at this wedding. He was the reason I had made it this far in life. And before the night was over, the entire room was about to learn something about him that would change the way everyone looked at him forever. The longer I stood there watching the room, the more the small details began to settle into my mind like puzzle pieces that did not quite fit together. My husband, Ryan Whitmore, was across the ballroom laughing with his college friends near the bar, completely unaware of the tension quietly forming between our two families. The golden lights above the dance floor reflected off the crystal glasses and polished silverware, and guests moved through the room in elegant dresses and dark suits, enjoying the evening exactly the way a wedding reception was supposed to feel. But every time my father passed by one of my husband's relatives, I noticed the same subtle reactions. A raised eyebrow, a polite smile that disappeared the moment he walked away, a whisper behind a hand. None of it was loud enough to cause a scene, but it was just enough to leave a quiet sting in the air. My father did not seem to notice any of it. He stood by the window for a while, looking out toward the lake where the evening sun had begun to sink behind the mountains. The water outside shimmered in shades of gold and orange, and for a moment the entire ballroom felt calm again. Then my mother-in-law, Patricia Whitmore, approached him with the same tight smile she had worn all afternoon. I watched from across the room as she spoke to him. My father nodded politely while she talked, the way he always did when someone addressed him. Later he told me she had asked what he did for a living, and when he said he owned a small auto repair shop outside the city, her smile had grown thinner. Apparently, she had replied with a soft laugh and said something like, "Well, that must keep you busy." The tone was the kind people use when they are trying very hard to sound impressed, while actually meaning the opposite. My father had simply shrugged and said he enjoyed fixing things. That was all he ever said about his work. To him it was honest labor, something that paid the bills and kept food on the table. But to my husband's family, it seemed to confirm whatever quiet assumptions they had already made. I noticed my aunt from my side of the family standing near him a few minutes later, chatting warmly and touching his arm while they talked. That small gesture reminded me of something important. The people who truly knew my father never saw embarrassment when they looked at him. They saw the man who drove 3 hours through a snowstorm just to bring me a forgotten science project when I was 12 years old. They saw the man who worked double shifts for 6 months, so I could afford my first semester of college without taking out another loan. They saw someone dependable. But standing in that ballroom, surrounded by polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, I realized my husband's family did not know any of those stories. To them, he was just the quiet man in the outdated suit who did not seem to belong among bankers, lawyers, and executives. I felt the first real spark of anger begin to grow in my chest, because my father had never once been embarrassed by who he was. And I was beginning to understand that before the night was over, someone in that room was going to learn exactly why. I stood there watching the room slowly fill with laughter and music, but the uncomfortable feeling in my chest refused to fade. The string quartet had begun playing a softer melody while the catering staff moved between tables carrying trays of champagne and small desserts. Guests gathered in small circles, telling stories, taking photographs, and celebrating what should have been a joyful evening. From a distance, everything looked perfect. But when you looked closely, you could see the quiet lines dividing the room. My father was still near the large windows overlooking the lake, speaking calmly with one of the bartenders who had asked him about the classic pickup truck parked outside. I had seen the same truck pull into the hotel driveway earlier that afternoon, its paint slightly faded but polished carefully until it shined under the sunlight. My father had driven it for nearly 20 years, maintaining every bolt and wire himself. He had always said if you take care of something long enough, it will take care of you in return. Across the ballroom, my father-in-law Gerald Whitmore was speaking with several business partners from his investment firm. Their conversation carried the smooth rhythm of people used to discussing stocks, markets, and numbers that most people never even imagine. Ryan's family had built their reputation in that world. Private clubs, charity galas, corporate boardrooms. My father's world had always been different. Early mornings, grease-stained hands, the steady sound of tools striking metal. For a long time I had believed those two worlds could meet somewhere in the middle. But as I watched Patricia Whitmore whisper something again to her sister while glancing toward my father, I realized they had already made up their minds about him long before they ever shook his hand. A few minutes later, Ryan finally approached me, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to me with an easy smile, the same relaxed expression he had worn all evening. "Everything looks amazing," he said, glancing around the ballroom. "My parents were just saying how impressive this venue is." I followed his gaze toward the group, where his parents stood. They were smiling now, laughing at something one of their friends had said. From a distance, they looked warm and welcoming, exactly the way people expected them to appear at events like this. I wondered if Ryan had noticed the comments they had been making earlier, or if the entire situation had passed beneath his attention the way small things often do during weddings. My father walked toward us at that moment, holding his empty coffee cup. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful. "This place is something else," he said, looking up at the high ceiling and the elegant lights above us. "I have never seen a hotel lobby with marble floors like that before." Ryan smiled politely and nodded. "It is a beautiful property," he replied. My father thanked him again for inviting him to be part of the celebration, the same way he had already done 3 times that evening. That was the kind of man he was. Even on the day his daughter was getting married, he still acted as if he were the guest who should feel grateful simply for being allowed to stand in the room. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and something tightened quietly in my chest. Because the truth was simple. The man standing beside me had never asked the world for anything it did not already owe him through years of hard work and quiet sacrifice. And yet somehow, in the eyes of my new family, he had already been judged and dismissed. They saw a mechanic from a small town. They saw an old truck in the parking lot. They saw a suit that did not come from an expensive tailor. What they did not see was the kind of life a person builds when they spend decades showing up for everyone else without asking for applause. But the night was still young, and the ballroom doors had not yet opened for the next part of the reception. And very soon, someone was going to walk into that room who understood my father far better than any of them did. The music shifted as the band prepared for the first round of toasts, and guests slowly began returning to their seats. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow over the white tablecloths and crystal glasses. Servers moved quietly between tables, refilling water glasses and placing small candles in the center of each arrangement. It was the moment in the evening when everything slows down for a few minutes, when people settle into their chairs and turn their attention toward the front of the room. Ryan was called over by one of his groomsmen near the stage, leaving me standing beside my father near the dance floor. He folded his hands loosely in front of him and looked around with the quiet curiosity he always had whenever he visited a new place. "You really did something special here," he said softly. "Your mother would have loved seeing all this." My chest tightened slightly when he mentioned my mother. She had passed away nearly 6 years earlier, long before Ryan and I ever met. My father had attended every milestone in my life alone since then, sitting in the audience during college graduation, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. Even now, standing in this enormous ballroom surrounded by hundreds of guests, he still carried himself the same way he always had. Calm, observant, never demanding attention. Across the room, I noticed Patricia Whitmore watching us again. She leaned toward her husband and said something quietly. Gerald glanced over his shoulder at my father and gave a small, dismissive shrug before returning to his conversation. I could not hear what they said this time, but the tone was unmistakable. My father seemed unaware of it all. He was studying the large framed photographs along the wall that showed the hotel in different seasons. One image displayed the building surrounded by deep snow, the lake completely frozen beneath a pale winter sky. "Imagine keeping a place like this running through January," he said thoughtfully. "Heating bills alone must be something." I smiled faintly because that was exactly the kind of detail my father always noticed. Where other people saw elegance, he saw the systems underneath it. The pipes behind the walls. The wiring above the ceilings. The work required to keep everything operating smoothly every single day. Just then the ballroom doors at the far end of the room opened again. At first it seemed like nothing unusual. Guests were still arriving from the hotel lobby, and a few people stepped aside to allow someone important to pass through. The staff near the entrance straightened immediately when they saw him. A tall man in a dark navy suit walked into the room with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew every inch of the building around him. 2 members of the hotel staff followed a few steps behind him, speaking quietly while pointing toward different sections of the ballroom. Conversations around the entrance softened slightly as several guests recognized him. I did not understand why until he moved further into the light. Then I heard one of Ryan's business associates whisper to another guest, "That is Thomas Harrington. He owns the entire Lakeview property." The name carried a certain weight in the room. Even I had heard it before when we first booked the venue nearly a year earlier. The Harrington family had owned several luxury hotels across the western United States for decades. The man walking across the ballroom was the owner of the very building where we were standing. He paused near the center of the room, scanning the space as if checking that everything was running properly. Then his eyes moved across the crowd once more. And the moment he noticed my father standing beside me, his entire expression changed. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to slow down in a way that was almost impossible to describe. The tall man who had just entered the room paused mid-step, his attention locked on my father, as if he had suddenly recognized someone he had not expected to see. Conversations continued around us, but I could feel the shift in the air the way people sometimes sense an approaching storm before the sky changes color. My father was still looking at the framed winter photograph on the wall, completely unaware that the owner of the entire hotel was now walking directly toward him. Thomas Harrington crossed the polished marble floor with calm, measured steps. Several members of the hotel staff straightened as he passed them, quietly stepping aside to give him space. A few guests near the entrance turned their heads to watch, curious about where he was going. When he finally reached us, he stopped only a few feet from my father and studied him for a second with a look that slowly transformed into a broad, genuine smile. "Daniel Carter," he said in a voice that carried easily across the nearby tables. "I cannot believe it is really you." My father blinked in surprise and turned fully toward him. For a moment he looked puzzled, as if trying to place the face standing in front of him. Then recognition spread across his expression and his entire posture changed. "Tom Harrington," he replied, the surprise in his voice unmistakable. "Well, I will be. It has been a long time." The two men shook hands warmly, the kind of handshake shared between people who had known each other long before this elegant ballroom ever entered the picture. I noticed several nearby guests watching the exchange with sudden interest, including my father-in-law Gerald Whitmore, who had just turned away from his conversation. Thomas Harrington laughed softly and looked around the room as if remembering something from years ago. "You have not changed at all," he said. "Still wearing the same calm expression you had the day you saved my first hotel from shutting down." My father gave a modest shrug. "I only fixed a problem with the boiler system," he said simply. "Anyone with the right tools could have done it." Thomas Harrington shook his head immediately. "That is not true, and you know it," he replied. "The entire heating system had failed in the middle of December. We had over 200 guests in the building, and every contractor in the city told me it would take 3 days to repair. You walked in with a toolbox and kept the place running before the temperature dropped below freezing." A few people standing nearby exchanged curious looks as the story unfolded. My father shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention now turning toward him. "It was just another repair job," he said quietly. "You paid me fairly for the work." Thomas Harrington smiled again, but there was something deeper behind it now, something that carried the weight of genuine respect. "That repair job allowed my business to survive its first winter," he said. "Without it, this entire property might not even exist today." He gestured lightly toward the massive ballroom surrounding us. Crystal chandeliers hung above hundreds of guests. The polished floors reflected the warm glow of candlelight. Every elegant detail in the room suddenly felt different now that people understood the connection between the quiet mechanic in the worn suit and the man who owned the building. And for the first time that evening, I noticed my mother-in-law Patricia Whitmore staring at my father with an expression that no longer looked amused at all. For a few seconds after Thomas Harrington finished speaking, the air around our table felt strangely still, as if the entire ballroom had paused just long enough for people to process what they had heard. The music from the quartet continued softly in the background, but nearby conversations had clearly shifted direction. Guests who had been chatting moments earlier were now glancing in our direction with open curiosity. My father shifted his weight slightly and rubbed the back of his neck, the way he always did when he felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. "Tom, you're giving me too much credit," he said calmly. "Any good mechanic could have figured that system out." Thomas Harrington laughed again, but this time his voice carried a hint of disbelief. "Daniel, I called every major contractor in Colorado that week," he replied. "They all said the same thing. Replace the entire heating system. 3 days minimum. You looked at it for 10 minutes and told me exactly which valve had failed." My father shrugged again, his expression steady. "Experience helps," he said simply. "Machines talk if you listen long enough." I noticed Ryan walking toward us again, curiosity written across his face as he tried to understand what was happening. He had clearly heard enough of the conversation to realize something unusual was unfolding. "Dad, Mom," he called toward his parents across the room. "You should come meet Mr. Harrington." Gerald Whitmore and Patricia Whitmore approached with polite smiles that looked noticeably more cautious now than they had earlier in the evening. Thomas Harrington turned toward them and extended his hand. "You must be the groom's parents," he said warmly. "Congratulations. Your son married into a remarkable family tonight." The sentence seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Patricia Whitmore blinked slightly before responding. "That is very kind of you to say," she replied, her voice suddenly softer than it had been earlier. Thomas Harrington gestured toward my father. "Daniel Carter is one of the most capable engineers I have ever met," he said matter-of-factly. "He never asked for recognition, but I have relied on his expertise more times than I can count." My father looked genuinely surprised at the word engineer. "Tom, you know I never went to college for that," he said. "I just fix things." "Exactly," Thomas Harrington answered. "You understand systems in a way most people never learn in a classroom." Around us, I could see several of Ryan's relatives listening carefully now. The earlier whispers and quiet laughs had disappeared entirely. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat and glanced briefly at my father before speaking. "So you have worked together before?" he asked. Thomas Harrington smiled. "More than once," he replied. "Whenever one of my older properties had a mechanical issue that nobody else could solve, Daniel was the person I called." He paused for a moment and looked across the ballroom at the massive chandeliers and polished floors. "In fact," he added calmly, "the reason this building still operates as smoothly as it does today is because Daniel helped redesign part of the original heating infrastructure during that first winter." I watched Patricia Whitmore's expression change as the meaning of that sentence settled in. The elegant ballroom surrounding us suddenly looked less like a stage for quiet judgment and more like a reminder of something my father had quietly contributed to years ago. My father simply stood there with the same calm posture he had carried all evening, completely unchanged by the shift in attention. Because the truth was simple. He had never needed anyone in that room to approve of who he was. The silence that followed Thomas Harrington's explanation was not dramatic or loud, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Conversations around us slowly resumed, yet the tone of the room had changed in a subtle way. A few guests nearby nodded respectfully toward my father, while others seemed to be quietly reconsidering the assumptions they had made earlier in the evening. My father, however, remained exactly the same as he had been all night. He held his empty coffee cup with both hands and looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention now surrounding him. "Tom, you always had a way of making simple things sound complicated," he said gently. "All I did was help you get through a rough winter." Thomas Harrington shook his head again, though this time his smile carried the calm certainty of someone who had already made up his mind years ago. "Daniel, you kept an entire hotel full of guests comfortable during a snowstorm that nearly shut down half the state," he replied. "That was not a simple repair." Ryan stood beside me now, listening carefully to the exchange. I could see the mixture of surprise and curiosity on his face as he glanced between my father and the man who owned the entire property. "I had no idea you two knew each other," Ryan said quietly. My father gave a modest shrug. "It was a long time ago," he answered, "before any of this place was fully renovated." Thomas Harrington gestured lightly toward the ballroom again, his hand sweeping across the high ceilings and shining chandeliers. "Before most of this existed at all," he added, "Daniel helped me understand how the entire mechanical system of this building could be rebuilt without shutting down operations for months." Gerald Whitmore shifted slightly where he stood. The confident posture he had carried earlier in the evening seemed less certain now. "You mean he designed part of the infrastructure?" he asked carefully. My father opened his mouth to correct the statement, but Thomas Harrington answered first. "He solved the problem that everyone else said could not be solved," he said calmly. "Titles do not matter nearly as much as results." Patricia Whitmore folded her hands together, her expression noticeably quieter than before. The earlier amusement that had colored her voice had completely disappeared. Instead, she looked at my father with the cautious attention people sometimes give to someone they realize they have misunderstood. My father did not seem to notice the shift at all. He was studying the lights above the dance floor again, clearly more interested in the craftsmanship of the fixtures than in the conversation unfolding around him. "Those chandeliers must weigh a few £100 each," he said thoughtfully. "The support beams above them must be reinforced pretty carefully." Thomas Harrington laughed softly at that observation. "You see," he said, turning slightly toward Ryan and his parents. "He always looks at the systems behind the beauty." For a moment no one responded. The elegant ballroom, which had earlier felt like a place where my father did not quite belong, now looked very different. The polished floors, the towering windows, the carefully balanced warmth in the air all carried traces of the quiet work he had once done without asking for recognition. I looked at him standing there in the same slightly worn suit he had owned for years and realized something simple and powerful at the same time. My father had walked into that ballroom exactly the same man he had always been. The only thing that had changed tonight was the way other people were finally beginning to see him. For the first time that evening, I noticed something unusual happening around the tables closest to us. People who had previously been focused on their own conversations were now listening quietly, their attention drawn toward the calm exchange between my father and the man who owned the entire hotel. No one was staring in an obvious way, but the energy of the room had shifted in that subtle way that happens when a story begins to unfold in real time. Thomas Harrington seemed completely comfortable standing beside my father, as if the elegant ballroom meant very little compared to the memory he clearly carried from years earlier. "Daniel never liked talking about it," he said calmly, glancing at the Whitmores before continuing. "But during that winter, the entire city was dealing with record temperatures. The heating systems across half the region were failing under the pressure. When mine broke down, every engineer I hired insisted the entire system needed to be replaced." My father shook his head slightly, clearly hoping the conversation would move on. "Tom, you are making it sound more dramatic than it was," he said quietly. But Thomas Harrington continued anyway. "The replacement estimate alone would have cost more than the entire hotel was worth at that time," he said. "If we had closed for even a week, the business would not have survived its first year." Ryan listened carefully now, his earlier casual expression replaced by genuine interest. "So, what did he do?" he asked. Thomas Harrington smiled again, the memory clearly vivid in his mind. "Daniel walked through the basement mechanical room for about 15 minutes. He listened to the pipes, checked the pressure valves, and told me the real problem was a faulty control assembly that nobody else had even noticed." He paused briefly before adding, "Then he stayed here through the entire night repairing it piece by piece, so the guests would never feel the temperature drop." I glanced at my father, who now looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. He rubbed his hands together and looked down at the floor. "It was just maintenance work," he said. But Thomas Harrington gently disagreed. "It saved the hotel," he replied simply. Around us, I could see several of Ryan's relatives exchanging quiet looks. Earlier in the evening, they had watched my father with mild amusement, whispering small comments behind polite smiles. Now those expressions had changed into something far more thoughtful. Patricia Whitmore cleared her throat softly before speaking again, her tone noticeably different from before. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "I had no idea you had been involved in something like that." My father lifted his head slightly and gave the same modest smile he had worn all evening. "Most people would not," he replied. "I run a small repair shop. That is usually enough excitement for me." Thomas Harrington chuckled quietly at that response. "He also refused every offer I made to bring him on as a permanent consultant," he added. "Said he preferred fixing engines in his own garage rather than sitting in corporate meetings." Ryan looked at my father with new curiosity now, as if he were seeing a completely different side of the quiet man he had known for years. My father noticed the look and simply shrugged again, the same calm gesture he always used when someone tried to turn his work into something larger than he believed it to be. The chandeliers above us reflected soft golden light across the ballroom, illuminating hundreds of guests who had gathered to celebrate a wedding. Yet in that moment, the most remarkable thing in the room was not the music, the decorations, or the luxury surrounding us. It was the quiet realization spreading slowly across the faces of several people who were beginning to understand that the man they had quietly judged earlier that evening had never needed their approval in the first place. The music in the ballroom slowly grew louder again as the band prepared for the first official toast of the evening, but the quiet shift that had taken place around our group had not disappeared. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. The same people who had earlier looked at my father with mild curiosity or quiet amusement were now watching him with a different kind of attention. Not dramatic admiration, not exaggerated respect, just a calm awareness that the man they had dismissed so easily carried a history none of them had bothered to understand. My father, however, seemed entirely untouched by the change. He stood with the same relaxed posture he had held all evening, studying the polished wooden floor beneath the dance lights as if he were evaluating how well the surface had been maintained over the years. "Looks like they refinished this floor not too long ago," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "You can tell by the way the grain still catches the light." Thomas Harrington smiled when he heard that observation. "3 years ago," he confirmed. "And you're correct about the grain." Ryan laughed softly beside me, shaking his head with disbelief. "You can tell that just by looking at it?" he asked my father. My father gave the same small shrug that had followed nearly every compliment that evening. "When you work with machinery and materials long enough, you start noticing small things," he said. "Floors, engines, heating systems. They all tell their stories if you pay attention." Gerald Whitmore looked around the ballroom again, his earlier confidence replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful expression. "Well," he said carefully, "this place certainly tells an impressive story." Thomas Harrington nodded slightly, but then turned back toward my father with a tone that carried both gratitude and familiarity. "Daniel never wanted recognition for any of it," he said calmly. After that winter, he simply went back to his garage and continued fixing engines the way he always had. My father smiled faintly at that description. "That is because engines are honest," he replied. "They break, you repair them, and they run again. No meetings required." A few people nearby laughed softly at that remark, but the laughter carried warmth rather than mockery. Patricia Whitmore stood quietly beside her husband now, her gaze resting on my father for a moment longer than necessary before she spoke. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "I think we may have underestimated you earlier this evening." My father looked slightly confused by the statement and waved his hand dismissively. "There is nothing to underestimate," he replied. "I am simply Emily's father." The simplicity of that answer seemed to settle something in the room that had been slightly out of balance since the reception began. I looked around the ballroom again, taking in the chandeliers, the music, the laughter returning to the tables, and I realized something that made the entire evening feel different. My father had not walked into this wedding hoping to impress anyone. He had not needed titles, introductions, or recognition from powerful people in expensive suits. He had arrived for one reason only: to stand beside his daughter on the most important day of her life. And as the music swelled and guests began moving toward the dance floor, it became clear that the quiet man in the worn gray suit had never been out of place in that ballroom at all. The only mistake that had been made that night was the one others had made when they assumed they understood who he was.